You're nothing but a burden, Margaret. A senile old woman who can't even remember where she put her pills. It's time we face reality here. The words hit like ice water in my veins. My son David stood in my kitchen doorway, his face twisted with impatience and something darker. Behind him, my daughter-in-law Sarah clutched a manila folder against her chest like a shield. The morning light streaming through my Washington State farmhouse windows caught the cruel satisfaction in her eyes. I could smell the coffee I'd been brewing for them still bubbling in the machine, the familiar sound now seeming to mock the hospitality I'd shown. My granddaughter Emma sat frozen at the kitchen table, her spoon halfway to her mouth, cereal milk dripping back into the bowl. At 16, she'd seen enough family arguments to know when the adults were about to destroy something precious. The air felt thick and electric, like the moments before lightning strikes the tall Douglas firs outside my windows. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, but 30 years as a paralegal had taught me to keep my face perfectly still when people showed their true nature. I see, I said quietly, setting down my coffee cup with the same care I'd used filing court documents for 3 decades. The ceramic made no sound against the wooden table. And what exactly does reality look like in your mind, David? My voice carried none of the tremor I felt inside. Instead, I watched them with the same attention I'd once used reading depositions, catching every micro-expression, every tell that revealed what they really wanted. Sarah stepped forward, emboldened by what she mistook for my weakness. Her manicured fingers tapped against the folder, and I noticed how her wedding ring, my mother's ring, caught the light. Reality is that you can't live alone anymore, Margaret. You're forgetting things. Yesterday you called me Susan. She spoke with the practiced tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. But I remembered every word I'd ever spoken to Sarah, including the deliberate test I'd given her the day before. The silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap. Emma's eyes moved between her parents and me, searching for understanding in a moment that would change everything. I reached across the table and touched her hand gently, feeling how cold her fingers had become. "It's all right, sweetheart," I whispered. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make very important decisions." But even as I comforted her, I was already 3 steps ahead, my mind cataloging everything they'd revealed in their moment of assumed triumph. The folder in Sarah's hands seemed to pulse with malicious intent as she slid it across my oak dining table. Inside were forms, legal documents with my name typed in neat rows. The conservatorship paperwork felt heavy in my hands, heavier than the law books I'd carried for Judge Morrison all those years. They'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. The dates on the medical evaluations they'd somehow arranged told a story of calculated deception that made my chest tighten with rage I couldn't show. "We've already spoken to Dr. Henderson about your episodes," David said, avoiding my eyes the way he had as a child when caught in lies. The same nervous energy that used to give him away during parent-teacher conferences now betrayed his discomfort with this adult betrayal. "He agrees that you need supervised care. Sarah found a lovely facility in Spokane that specializes in memory care." Memory care. The words tasted bitter as ash in my mouth. I thought of Mrs. Chun, my old boss's mother, who died within 6 months of being placed in such a facility. The woman who'd once run a successful restaurant empire reduced to staring at soap operas she didn't understand. But they didn't know about my visits to Mrs. Chun, or how I'd learned exactly what happened to elderly people whose families wanted their assets more than their company. Emma pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself just 2 years ago. "Dad, what are you talking about? Grandma's fine. She helped me with calculus last week." Her voice cracked with confusion and fear. At 16, she understood the mathematics of derivatives, but not the cruel calculus adults used to justify stealing from their own family. "Emma, go to your room," Sarah snapped, her mask slipping to reveal the irritation underneath. "This is grown-up business." But Emma was my granddaughter, raised with the same stubborn spine that had carried me through law school night classes while David was still in diapers. She crossed her arms and stayed exactly where she was, her jaw set in defiance. I watched this exchange with the calm focus I'd learned during those years supporting Judge Morrison's courtroom. Every detail mattered. Every word revealed motivation. Sarah's rush to dismiss Emma. David's inability to meet anyone's eyes. The way they'd chosen a Saturday morning when Emma would be here, thinking a child's presence would make me more compliant. They'd miscalculated badly, but I wouldn't correct their mistake. "Not yet. Let her stay," I said softly. "She should understand what's happening to her family." The weeks that followed revealed the true scope of their planning. David began showing up unannounced, using his key to let himself into my house like he owned it already. He'd make comments about my failing memory, while Sarah inventoried my possessions with the hungry eyes of someone mentally dividing spoils. They brought strangers, a social worker, a nurse, people with clipboards and sympathetic smiles who asked leading questions designed to document my supposed incompetence. "Mrs. Patterson, do you remember what you had for breakfast this morning?" the social worker asked during one particularly intrusive visit. She sat in my living room taking notes while David and Sarah flanked her like legal counsel. I could smell Sarah's overpowering perfume mixing with the lavender I'd planted outside these windows, creating a cloying combination that made my stomach turn. "Steel-cut oats with blueberries and a touch of maple syrup," I answered truthfully. "The same breakfast I've eaten every Tuesday for the past 5 years. I didn't mention that I'd also reviewed my investment portfolio that morning, or that I'd called my banker to inquire about recent attempts to access my accounts. Some information was better kept private until the right moment." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My late husband's reading chair, where Robert used to solve crossword puzzles and plan his carpentry projects. "But Mom, you asked me who the president was yesterday. You seemed confused." His voice carried a false concern that would have been laughable if it weren't so calculating. I remembered our conversation perfectly. I'd asked him to name the president as a test of his honesty, curious if he'd claim I was confused about something so basic. Sarah leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "We're just worried about you living alone in this big house, Margaret. What if you fell? What if you forgot to turn off the stove?" She gestured around my meticulously maintained home, as if it were a dangerous obstacle course. But I knew every creaking floorboard, every quirk of the old plumbing, every corner where dust tried to hide from my weekly cleaning routine. Emma appeared in the doorway holding a glass of water, but I saw her real purpose in the way her phone was positioned. Smart girl. She'd inherited more than stubbornness from me. She'd learned to document everything. "Grandma, you wanted some water," she said innocently, but her eyes met mine with understanding. We were building a case, though she didn't fully realize it yet. The social worker's visit was being recorded, their questions and my coherent answers preserved for a future they couldn't imagine. I found the additional folder 3 days later, hidden behind the false back of my husband's old desk drawer. A hiding place David remembered from childhood, but thought I'd forgotten about. The papers inside made my blood run cold in ways the conservatorship documents hadn't prepared me for. Property transfer forms. Lists of my assets. A business plan for converting my farmhouse into rental income. They weren't just planning to institutionalize me, they were planning to profit from it. The most damning document was a letter Sarah had written to David, outlining their strategy. Her handwriting, which I recognized from years of birthday cards and thank you notes, laid out their timeline with business-like precision. Once the conservatorship is established, we can liquidate her investments to pay for care. The house should sell for at least $800,000 in this market. Emma's college fund could easily come from the proceeds. My hands trembled as I read about Emma's future being bartered away like poker chips. They'd calculated everything: my life expectancy, the cost of memory care, how much they stood to inherit if they played their cards right. Sarah had even researched the mortality rates at different facilities, circling the ones with the shortest average stays. The clinical coldness of it made my chest tight with fury and grief. I sat in Robert's chair, surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal, and felt something shift inside me like tectonic plates realigning. The paralegal who'd spent decades watching justice play out in courtrooms was fully awake now. I could smell the familiar scent of my husband's aftershave still lingering in the chair's fabric, and I imagined him nodding approval for what I was about to do. Emma found me there an hour later. Tears dried but resolve hardened into something unbreakable. "Grandma? You look different," she said, settling onto the carpet beside my chair the way she had as a little girl listening to bedtime stories. Her intuition was remarkable. She sensed the change in me like animals sense coming storms. "I need to tell you some things, sweetheart," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "About your parents' plans. About what they don't know about your grandmother. And about what we're going to do to protect our family." I showed her the papers, watching her face cycle through shock, hurt, and finally, a determination that mirrored my own. She was 16, old enough to understand betrayal, and young enough to believe in justice. The next phase required delicate maneuvering. I had to appear increasingly frail and confused while actually gathering the evidence that would destroy their conspiracy. Every morning, I reviewed the notes I kept hidden in my bedroom safe, the same safe where I'd stored important documents throughout my legal career. David and Sarah had no idea it existed, hidden behind my bedroom mirror with a combination they'd never guess. I began making deliberate mistakes during their visits, each one carefully calculated to feed their narrative while serving my larger purpose. When David commented on my confusion about finances, I pretended not to remember my account balances while secretly downloading 3 months of bank statements that showed their unsuccessful attempts to access my money. When Sarah questioned my ability to manage medications, I acted bewildered while actually researching the side effects of drugs they'd been suggesting I needed. "Mom, you seem to be having trouble with simple tasks," David said during one particularly staged performance. I'd deliberately put salt in my coffee that morning, knowing he'd arrive during my usual breakfast time. The disgusted expression on my face when I tasted it was genuine, but not for the reasons he assumed. I was disgusted by how easily he accepted my supposed decline, how eagerly he cataloged each sign of weakness. My old colleagues from Judge Morrison's office became invaluable allies, though they had no idea they were helping me build a case. When I called Betty Richardson, the retired court reporter, to chat about old times, she mentioned that her daughter worked in elder care law. "Such a growing field," Betty said innocently. "So many families trying to protect their elderly relatives from exploitation." The irony was perfect. My son thought he was protecting his inheritance from my confusion, while I was actually protecting myself from his greed. Emma proved to be an excellent co-conspirator. She'd arrive for our weekend visits carrying school books, but hidden inside her calculus textbook were copies of every document she'd helped me photograph. We developed a system of signals and coded conversations that let us communicate our progress without arousing suspicion. When she said she was struggling with word problems, it meant she'd overheard something important. When I offered to help her with research, we were actually reviewing the evidence against her parents. The most crucial piece came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor of 20 years, knocked on my door one evening with fresh-baked cookies and devastating information. Margaret, I hope you don't mind me saying, but that woman who comes to see you, your son's wife, she was asking me strange questions about you. Wanted to know if I'd seen you acting confused or forgetful. Mrs. Henderson's weathered hands shook slightly as she spoke. It felt like she wanted me to say yes, if you understand my meaning. The near discovery came on a Tuesday morning when David arrived unexpectedly, while I was reviewing bank statements at my kitchen table. I heard his key in the lock just seconds before he would have seen everything spread across my table. Proof that I was far from the confused woman he believed me to be. My 30 years of legal training kicked in, and I swept the papers into my apron pocket with movements so smooth they seemed natural. "Morning, Mom," David said, studying my face for signs of the confusion he expected. I let my eyes look slightly unfocused and touched my temple as if fighting a headache. What was I doing? I asked, looking around the kitchen with manufactured bewilderment. The performance came so easily now that it almost frightened me. I'd become an expert at playing the victim while planning my victory. "You were probably trying to balance your checkbook again," he said with false patience. "Remember, we talked about how that's getting too complicated for you?" He moved toward the table where I'd been working, and I held my breath as his eyes scanned the surface. One forgotten paper would ruin everything. But the table was clear except for my morning coffee cup and the newspaper crossword I'd been using as cover. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later with more forms to sign. "These are just updates to your medical information, Margaret," she explained, but I recognized power of attorney documents when I saw them. My signature on these papers would give them control over my healthcare decisions. The final piece they needed before moving me to that facility in Spokane. The doctor said it would be helpful to have someone who can make medical choices if you're not feeling well. I pretended to read the documents with the squinting confusion of someone whose mind was slipping, but actually I was memorizing every detail. The law office that had prepared them, the date they planned to file, the specific powers they were trying to claim. "This seems very complicated," I said finally, setting the papers aside. "Can I think about it for a day or two?" David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They were running out of patience, which meant they'd escalate soon. "Mom, the doctor really thinks you should sign these today. You know how you sometimes forget things we've discussed." His voice carried a new edge, frustration bleeding through his manufactured concern. I could smell his anxiety like cologne gone sour in the heat. That evening, Emma called with our coded message about struggling with story problems. When I called back from my neighbor's phone, she whispered urgently into her cell. "They're planning something for this weekend. I heard Dad on the phone with someone about moving forward with the timeline. He said they couldn't wait much longer." The pieces were falling into place faster than I'd anticipated, which meant my own timeline had to accelerate. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that makes Washington State feel like the edge of the world. I dressed carefully in my oldest house dress, the one with the faded flowers that made me look smaller and more fragile than my usual tailored clothes. My makeup was deliberately minimal, just enough to seem like I'd forgotten how to properly apply it. When I looked in the mirror, I saw exactly what David and Sarah expected to see. A confused old woman losing her grip on reality. They arrived with Dr. Patterson, a physician I'd never met who carried himself with the brisk efficiency of someone being paid to provide predetermined conclusions. Emma wasn't with them, which confirmed my suspicions about what they planned to accomplish today. "Mrs. Patterson," the doctor began, settling into my living room like he owned it. "Your son tells me you've been having some memory difficulties." "Have I?" I asked, allowing genuine confusion to color my voice. It was confusion, but not about my memories. I was confused by how easily these educated adults accepted the fiction my son was selling them. I remember some things very clearly, like how David used to hide under his bed during thunderstorms when he was 8. Or how Sarah borrowed $5,000 from us for her business and never paid it back. Sarah's face flushed at this perfectly timed revelation. That's exactly what we're talking about, Doctor. She brings up ancient history, but can't remember what happened yesterday. But I saw the flash of panic in her eyes. She'd hoped I'd actually forgotten about the loan, had built her financial plans around the assumption that my memory was truly failing. The doctor asked me a series of standard questions. What year it was, who was president, simple arithmetic. I answered everything correctly, but with a hesitation that suggested uncertainty. When he asked me to remember 3 words and repeat them back later, I deliberately forgot one while secretly using it as the key to unlock my phone's voice recorder app, capturing every word of their conversation for later use. Mrs. Patterson seems to have some mild cognitive concerns, the doctor concluded, writing notes in his tablet with practiced efficiency. Nothing severe, but perhaps some assistance with daily tasks would be beneficial. It was exactly the diagnosis they'd paid for, delivered with just enough medical authority to satisfy their legal requirements. David leaned forward with barely contained eagerness. So you'd recommend some kind of supervised living situation? The hunger in his voice was almost pathetic. This was my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died. The child I'd put through college with my paralegal salary and sheer determination. Now he sat in my living room plotting my imprisonment like I was a stranger. As they discussed my future like I wasn't present, I let my mind wander to the final preparations I'd made. The evidence was compiled. The allies were in position. Emma knew her role. All I had to do was play the helpless victim for a little bit longer, until the moment came to reveal exactly who they were dealing with. The meek grandmother facade was about to disappear forever. The trap was set with the precision I'd learned from watching Judge Morrison orchestrate complex legal proceedings. Every document had been copied. Every conversation had been recorded. Every witness had been prepared, though most didn't realize they were witnesses to anything more than an elderly woman's family troubles. The beauty of it was that David and Sarah had created most of the evidence against themselves, so confident in my supposed helplessness that they'd stopped being careful about what they said in front of me. Monday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. "Mom, we've found the perfect place for you," David announced, his voice carrying the false cheer of someone delivering news he thought I couldn't understand. "It's a beautiful facility with gardens and activities. Sarah's already spoken to the admissions coordinator." The speed of their timeline confirmed what Emma had overheard. They were running out of patience and moving to close their trap. "When would I need to go?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of tremulous uncertainty into my voice. Behind my performance, my mind was calculating the exact timing I needed. The legal documents I'd prepared with Betty Richardson's daughter were already filed, but not yet served. The financial protections I'd put in place would activate the moment anyone tried to access my accounts without proper authorization. Sarah's response revealed more than she intended. "Well, the room is available immediately. We thought maybe this weekend would be good. Give you time to pack just the essentials." Just the essentials. They'd already decided which of my possessions were worth keeping, and which could be discarded along with my independence. The casual cruelty of it made my hands shake, but not with the frailty they assumed. I spent that afternoon in what would be my final performance as the confused victim. Emma arrived after school to find me sitting in Robert's chair, apparently staring into space. "Grandma," she said, playing her part perfectly. "Are you okay?" But when she hugged me, I felt her slip a small device into my pocket. The final piece of recording equipment we'd need for tomorrow's confrontation. That evening, I sat in my kitchen one last time as Margaret Patterson, the confused old woman who'd forgotten how to be dangerous. Tomorrow, I would become someone very different. I would become the paralegal who'd spent 3 decades learning how the legal system worked, who'd watched powerful people fall when their victims finally fought back, who'd raised a son with love and sacrifice only to discover that some people mistake kindness for weakness. The moonlight streaming through my windows felt like a benediction on the justice that was coming. They arrived Thursday morning with moving boxes, and the triumphant air of people who believed they'd already won. David carried papers from the memory care facility, while Sarah had a clipboard listing my possessions they'd decided to keep. Emma sat beside me on the couch, holding my hand with the gentle pressure that meant everything was ready. The morning light streaming through my windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and I thought how appropriate it was that the truth would finally settle like dust after a storm. "All right, Mom," David began, setting the boxes down with theatrical gentleness. "We're here to help you pack for your move. The facility is expecting you this afternoon." His voice carried the patronizing tone adults use with very young children, as if I were too simple to understand the magnitude of what they were taking from me. I looked up at him with the same mild confusion I'd perfected over the past weeks. "Move? Oh yes, I think you mentioned something about that." But as I spoke, I pressed the button Emma had given me, activating recording devices in 3 different locations. Every word from this moment forward would be captured with perfect clarity. Sarah stepped forward with her clipboard, ready to inventory my life like a yard sale. "We've identified the essential items you'll need, Margaret. Your clothes, some photographs, maybe a few books." She gestured dismissively at the home I'd built with Robert, at 40 years of memories and investments in carefully chosen possessions. "The rest can be donated or sold to help pay for your care." "That's very thoughtful of you both," I said quietly, rising from the couch with the careful movements they expected from a frail old woman. But instead of shuffling toward my bedroom to pack, I walked to my desk and opened the top drawer. "Before we do that, though, I have some things I'd like to show you." The first document I placed on the coffee table was the psychiatric evaluation I'd undergone voluntarily 3 weeks ago, showing perfect cognitive function and mental competency. David's face went pale as he read Dr. Martinez's assessment. "Mrs. Patterson shows no signs of dementia, confusion, or inability to manage her affairs. She is mentally sharp and fully capable of independent living." The second document was the audio transcript of Sarah's phone conversation with the memory care facility, where she discussed my rapidly declining condition and asked about their policies for residents who died within the first year. "You see," I said conversationally, "I had my phone company provide me with recordings of all calls made from my landline. Technology is so helpful these days." Sarah's face had gone from confident to confused to terrified in the span of 30 seconds. "Margaret, I don't understand what you're trying to," she began, but I held up one finger in the universal gesture for silence. After 30 years of watching attorneys present evidence, I knew the value of proper pacing. The third document was the complete financial investigation I'd commissioned, showing their attempts to access my accounts, their research into my assets, and the business plan they'd developed for liquidating my property. "Did you know that banks are required to report suspicious activity? Especially when family members try to gain access to accounts belonging to supposedly incompetent elderly relatives." Emma squeezed my hand as I placed the final document on the table. The restraining order that had been served to them both that morning, prohibiting any contact with me or my property pending a full investigation into elder abuse and financial exploitation. "The sheriff's deputies should be arriving any moment to escort you from my property," I said calmly. You're no longer welcome in my home. 6 months later, I sit in my garden watching Emma practice parallel parking in the driveway, preparing for her driver's test next week. The restraining order has become a permanent legal barrier between me and the son who tried to steal my life, and the daughter-in-law who saw dollar signs where she should have seen family. The memory care facility they'd chosen for me was shut down by the state after my investigation revealed a pattern of resident abuse and financial exploitation. David lost his job when his employer learned about the elder abuse charges. Sarah's business collapsed when her investors discovered her legal troubles. They're facing criminal charges for attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and their divorce proceedings have become a public spectacle of mutual blame and recrimination. I feel no satisfaction in their suffering, only a quiet sense that justice has finally balanced the scales. The most meaningful vindication came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen's daughter contacted me after reading about my case in the local newspaper. My mother always said you were the smartest person in Judge Morrison's office. She told me over coffee at the diner where her mother had once held court. She would have loved knowing that you fought back and won. We talked for hours about our mothers, about the system that fails elderly people, and about the importance of refusing to be victims. Emma has thrived in the stable environment we've created. Her college fund, the one Sarah planned to steal, has grown enough to cover 4 years at any university she chooses. She's decided to study law, inspired by what she calls the summer grandma became a superhero. Her parents have visitation rights supervised by the court, but she's old enough to choose how often she uses them. Mostly she doesn't. The house feels peaceful now, filled with the sounds of Emma's friends studying at my kitchen table, and the laughter of the book club I started for other elderly women who face family betrayal. We meet weekly, sharing stories and strategies, ensuring that none of us will ever be vulnerable to the kind of predation I barely escaped. Mrs. Henderson brings cookies, and we plan community workshops on recognizing the warning signs of elder abuse. I still sleep in Robert's chair sometimes, surrounded by the photographs and mementos that Sarah once planned to sell or discard. But now they feel like evidence of a life fully lived rather than remnants of a woman being erased. The legal documents that once threatened to steal my freedom have been replaced by papers establishing a foundation in Robert's name, dedicated to helping elderly people protect themselves from family financial abuse. When people ask me how I found the strength to fight back, I tell them about the moment I realized that being kind doesn't mean being weak, and that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you most need protection from. I survived 30 years in the legal system, raised a family, built a life worth defending. I wasn't about to let anyone, not even my own son, reduce me to a convenient victim in their financial plans. Emma graduates next month, and I'll be in the front row watching her walk across that stage toward the future she's chosen for herself. The inheritance David thought he was protecting will go to her education, and to the foundation that will help other grandmothers fight back when their families try to steal their dignity along with their assets. It's a legacy I can be proud of, built not on the weakness others assumed but on the strength I never stopped possessing. The story isn't over. It's just beginning, with a new chapter written in courtrooms and coffee shops, in the quiet victories of women who refuse to disappear simply because someone else finds their existence inconvenient. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always come when we expect it, but when it comes, it's worth every moment of the long wait.